The seventh Earl of Shaftesbury found great delight in his family seat, St Giles' house in Dorset. Down at the Saint, as he affectionately called it, he walked out of the new portico with its bust and down the drive to the village. Shaftesbury would take some satisfaction from the signs that Wimborne St Giles was on its way to becoming a model estate in days when the condition of the rural population lay almost entirely in the hands of landowners. He placed each cottage well back from the road, for example, believing that cottages would soon turn any area at the back into a mess, but would beautify the front as a garden. Once the Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli visited the house, and as he left, he said in his flowery way, "Goodbye, my dear Lord. You have given me the privilege of seeing one of the most impressive of all spectacles, a great English nobleman living in patriarchal state in his own hereditary halls." Shaftesbury, however, was far from a patriarch. It was the poor, rather than his great neighbours, that Shaftesbury loved to see at the Saint. In the galleried great halls, which in earlier centuries had been a courtyard, but was now roofed with glass, on every Sunday night he held a service of song, with families, visitors, servants, and cottagers, gathered together for hymn singing, the dogs carefully excluded. He was adored by his people and his tenants. On winter evenings, over wood fires in the cottages, they would tell of his deeds. Of the day, for instance, when he was driving to take the salute at a military review and passed an old woman hobbling along. He put her in the carriage. When the 1,000 troops presented arms to the Lord Lieutenant of Dorset, they saw him, Lord Shaftesbury, sitting in full uniform on the box beside the coachman, and the embarrassed old villager in the place of honour behind.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast. Sorry, listeners, I was suddenly transported in a reverie there. I didn't notice that Jeff had finished. I was reflecting on the villager and the coach and the Earl and on the next to the coachman. So there we are, a moment of historic travel there. But welcome back to the podcast. And today we are doing St Giles' House, which Jeff has introduced us to a little bit there through that quote. Thank you for reading that, Jeff. That was quite a marathon, but we got there and it was very interesting. So perhaps could you just, as we get cracking, introduce us to the house, the family, just tell us who they are, familiarise us.
Thanks, Rory. Yeah, so we've entitled today's episode as St Giles' House, the rise and fall of a country house, because St Giles really embodies the story of so many English country houses, but with a little twist at the end, which we'll get to at the end and talk about next week. But really, one of the great houses of England, one of the great families of England that rose to great prominence and then declined massively in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So St Giles, as you mentioned, Rory, is the home of the Earls of Shaftesbury, the Ashley Cooper family. That quote I read at the start was about the seventh Earl of Shaftesbury, who was known as the poor man's Earl. He was one of the great Victorian reformers. He passed all sorts of laws to help the poor, and we'll talk about him later. But it was
good. If I was an Earl, I think I would have liked to have been called the poor man's Earl.
I mean, what an extraordinary man. I mean, one of the reasons, Rory, I know this house so well is because I am a great admirer of this chap, Anthony Ashley Cooper, and I've read all his biographies, and that was indeed an extract from one of them. And it was hard to choose which bit to read from, which is why I went on a little bit, and I apologize, lovely listeners.
No, don't apologize. It was great, but I'm just curious if you could be an Earl, if you had a special name before yours, what would it be? I mean, obviously we've got things like Ethelred the Unready. What would your Earl title be? Do you think?
Oh God, that's a very good question, Rory.
The benign Earl, the grumpy Earl.
Yeah, I quite like the grumpy Earl. Jeffrey the Grump.
Jeffrey the Grump. That'd be very good.
Well, I'm Jeffrey with a G to our lovely American listeners as well. So it does sort of rhyme on paper, at least, if not when you say it.
Very good.
To the eye. So yeah, what would you be, Rory?
I think I'd be Rory the
Ready.
Rory the Ready. Well, that's funny. That's amusing, actually. You should say that because the Fraser family motto is "Je suis prêt," which means "I am ready." Or as my friends sometimes tease me, "Je suis prêt à manger," which is meaning. But the funny thing is that my extended Fraser family, I have to say, and I'm sure they'll forgive me for saying this, are never ever ready. And in fact, there are many stories of the Fraser family turning up en masse to battles in medieval Scotland, completely unready, and all being totally massacred. So it's quite an ironic family motto. Anyway,
Roy,
anyway.
on a side note, and we need to talk about this probably at the end, but I'm going to mention it now. I was on the phone this morning to one of our former guests, Sebastian Fennick, who, for our listeners who haven't listened, talked about Shilston House in Devon, this extraordinary house that he's pretty much built from scratch. And he said to me he met someone last week called Purdy Fraser. Who would that be, Rory?
I think that's a lovely cousin of mine. To
Okay.
confuse all listeners, he's the first cousin once removed or something mad like that.
Good. Okay. Well, I'll tell him he is. We assumed they were cousins. You were cousins. I mean, for our listeners, if you don't know, there are, I think, 13 million descendants of William the Conqueror living in England today, which means that we're all pretty much distant cousins. But some are more closely related than others. And I suspect Rory's related to half of, the Scottish aristocracy or something. But
well, that's very kind of you, Jeff. I'm not sure about that, but the Frasers certainly were very good at losing money and very good at procreating, which is a disaster combination. After the
actually, that links on quite nicely because, of course, I assume you were Catholics, or at least were.
We changed religion. I mean, dozens of times. I'm afraid we were terrible. We were very calculating.
The Ashley Coopers were interestingly so the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury was also known as the Puritan Earl. This is why I like him so much, Rory.
No! If we walked in, oh god,
he was very puritanical, and I love it. Anyway, we'll get on to it. Let me start with how the estate came into the family. So it actually has been it hasn't been sold since since records began. We know that the earliest record of an ancestor of the family living there was the 13th century, so the 1200s, when someone who was from the Melmaine family, who already owned the St Giles estate in Dorset, married someone called Robert de Plessis, and he died in 1301. And his great-grandson, Sir Nicholas de Plessis, died without a male heir. His daughter married someone called Sir John Hammerley, and he had a daughter who married Robert Ashley, who was from Wiltshire, and that's where the Ashley family came into it, and the estate is still owned by the Ashley Cooper family, the Earls of Shaftesbury. So we know that it goes back to through descent, probably right up to the Norman Conquest, and the Ashleys owned it through to the 16th century, where two of the Ashleys were both quite significant in their own right on the national stage in Britain, particularly in politics. And father and son were knighted. And the second, Sir Anthony Ashley, was briefly Elizabeth I's Secretary for War. And on a little side note, he is thought to have introduced the first cabbage into England from Holland. I think he fled to Holland at some point because he was very opposed having a Catholic king on the throne and opposed Charles II, and so he fled from Charles II after the Restoration and then came back after the Glorious Revolution. And so he introduced cabbages to England, which I don't think I'm particularly grateful for, because I'm not a fussy man, Rory, but I can't stand cabbage, especially the stuff you had at school, the green, stodgy stuff. I don't mind red cabbage.
I was about to say, especially given your love of Liz Truss and her being compared to the cabbage, I think I can see why you feel bitter about that particular vegetable at the moment.
Yeah, so we don't have much to thank him for, but he also built, he did clearly have some taste, because he built a lovely range of almshouses in Wimborne St Giles, which is the estate village, which we'll talk about shortly.
Shall we explain what almshouses are?
Yeah, we did an episode very early last year on almshouses, but we're now on episode 72, can you believe it, or 73? So we've marched on significantly. Why don't you explain very quickly to our listeners what almshouses are?
Very briefly, almshouses are, if you're driving through a village in England, or it could be in a city actually, but if you see normally a long, low block of what look like cottages connected together, with perhaps a clock tower or something in the middle, and they're very pretty, usually. That's usually a selection of almshouses, and they were built by landowners, sometimes hospitals, things like that, institutions, to put up to accommodate sort of what they termed the deserving poor, which were basically people who'd fallen into poverty, or they were widows, or they were basically relatively sort of down on their luck, but were considered to be deserving of charity, and so they'd be put into these places more or less rent free, And they're kind of interesting, beautiful architecture, and you see them dotted all over the English countryside.
They're one of I suppose they're the earliest form of social housing, really, aren't they? And they're a lesson that we can build beautiful social housing as well.
Yes, they are. Yeah, absolutely, and they are very pretty
and practical. But so he built. This was Sir Anthony Ashley, and he built these almshouses. He then died in 1628, and interestingly, this is an important thing. So there's an extraordinary tomb that's his in St Giles Church, Wimbledon St Giles Church, and it is this canopied tomb with this stone canopy, and at the foot of his tomb is his only daughter Anne kneeling at his feet. And this is important because it was Anne who married Sir John Cooper of Rockbourne in Wiltshire. And that was the unification, I suppose, of these two great families, the Ashleys and the Coopers. And so it was in 1620, the Ashley-Cooper dynasty was established, and they double-barreled so they could inherit both estates. And they had such vast landholdings across Hampshire, Wiltshire, Dorset, and Somerset that they were solidified as one of the wealthiest families in England. And this then enabled their child, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, to sort of rise to prominence as a great politician. So that's kind of where we end up. And now the current Earl of Shaftesbury is the 12th Earl of Shaftesbury. So it's passed through 12 generations of Ashley Coopers. Well, 13, 12 as Earls, and to the present day. And so that's sort of how
I want to interrupt you there, and just sort of, before we get on to what the first Earl did, who I imagine was quite a big cheese. What did the house look like to begin with? What was the original sort of structure-y vibe?
Yeah, so the house as we see it, I mean, no one knows what it was like pre, say, 17th century, early 17th century, but so the mid 17th century, Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, who later became the first Earl of Shaftesbury, started building this new house. This is an interesting time, Rory, as you're well aware, because it overlaps quite a lot with your specialism, which is English Baroque. But it's kind of a time when we're seeing a transition from sort of Jacobean or Renaissance architecture through to Palladian or more ostentatious Baroque styles. So, and we're seeing the sort of Carolean architecture, which is more refined classicism, and St Giles House, the original St Giles House, sort of embodied a blend of all those things. So it was red brick, which is more commonly associated with Jacobean architecture rather than faced in stone. But it is generally classical in design. But with whilst it not being sort of over the top, it was certainly not as elaborate as something like the Baroque. There was a Renaissance element to it. There were sort of crenellations around the roof. There was sort of a bust above the door. So there was an element of sort of Renaissance design that's
a bit slightly English Baroque designs by the sound of it.
A little bit Baroque, yeah. So this is what's interesting is that to be honest with you, there are no one knows the architect. There are some people say that it could be attributed to Inigo Jones. It's unlikely, but there are elements of his style certainly woven into the design of the early house.
Right.
So
okay, so that was the sort of first thing there.
First iteration of the house, yeah.
Right. And what happened then?
Well, from an architectural perspective, it evolved really kind of slowly over 5 generations from the first to the 5th Earls. So the early Earls, they continued to update the house as they went along. So the second Earl added formal gardens and made a few interiors changes, updated it a bit. Then the third Earl, who we'll talk about, was a really interesting man. He was influenced by more Baroque elements. So he added some ornamentation to the house. And then it was the 5th Earl, who died in 1811, who really sort of changed the house massively. So late Georgian, he introduced some neoclassical interiors, reconfigured the rooms, and added things like stucco work, plaster ceilings, classical cornices. He, I suppose, updated certainly the interiors, but also elements of the exterior, but it was I think it was slightly later that the house was really expanded upon and almost sort of chateauified. So it was given this sort of render, this sort of stucco render in the 19th century. And it was given this massive tower over the entrance with a huge mansard roof that looks very much like a French chateau. And it was just expanded, as so many Victorian houses were, for the huge influx in staffing, during a time when Britain was booming economically. So it grew massively then, and then that was sort of its peak in terms of size and scale and number of servants, and then we enter the declining period, which we'll talk about in a bit.
Okay. So I'm reeling from that description, but I'm developing quite a strong picture in my head. What's the name? Talk to me about the first Earl's relationship with John Locke.
Yeah, so it ties in quite strongly, Rory, with I suppose the collection at St Giles remains really important. So the architecture sort of tells the story of the evolution of British architecture, domestic architecture over time. But the collection is really important because it contains a huge number of tomes, particularly books, but also paintings on classical antiquity, the Enlightenment, philosophy, and later Reformed theology. The Reformed theology obviously applying to the seventh Earl, who we've mentioned was a bit of a Puritan. But the third Earl was a fascinating man who was basically John Locke's patron. So John Locke, if our listeners aren't aware, was probably one of the most influential thinkers in the Enlightenment. He was known as the father of liberalism. He wrote a lot about things like constitutional monarchies. He believed greatly in limiting absolute power, for example. He was very influential on American revolutionaries. He contributed to republicanism. He influenced Voltaire and Rousseau. An extraordinary man, really. And he basically, what happened was
the idea of contract theory. Really, that was his big thing in government. That the rule by a big honcho, aka a monarch, is with the consent of the people, and if that consent is broken, then the people have a right to depose that monarch, and that was revolutionary at the time because it destroyed the theory of absolute monarchy, essentially, and divine right, especially.
Exactly, and interestingly, and we'll get onto this in a sec, he also sort of pioneered the idea of written constitutions as a way of locking those freedoms into law, or into, in writing at least. And so he met Anthony Ashley Cooper, who at this point was Lord Ashley.
And sorry, forgive me, he became the third Earl, not the first Earl.
Yes, Rory, it was the first Earl of Shaftesbury, this chap who built this extraordinary house in red brick initially, before it was later altered. And he was a very influential politician. And we need to talk about this before we talk about his relationship with John Locke. So he ended up being Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Chancellor. He opposed the succession of James II. So he was very much pro-Protestant monarchs and backed the Glorious Revolution. And he is also seen as one of the founders of the Whig Party, which was sort of the Liberal Party back in the day, partly because of his patronage of John Locke. Yeah, he met John Locke when he had this liver infection in Oxford, and John Locke was a physician, a doctor, and he came and basically helped Shaftesbury get better. And he became Lord Shaftesbury's personal secretary. And John Locke ended up moving in with him as his, trusted right-hand man. And they began work. This is the interesting thing. They began work in 1667 on writing something called the Grand Model for the province of Carolina. And this is important because essentially Lord Shaftesbury was one of, I think, 8 people who were owners of the province of Carolina. So the province of Carolina, for those who aren't aware, was basically all the land that extended from Florida to Virginia, encompassing what's now North and South Carolina. Gosh. And there were 8, basically it was owned by 8 aristocrats from England. And these included, so they were called the Lords Proprietors. and they owned this extraordinary chunk of land in America. It consists essentially today, actually, it consists of Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. All fell within these land holdings that belonged to 8 British aristocrats. So you can have a bit of empathy, I suppose, for the American revolutionaries when you realize that these 8 Brits owned all this land in America. And Shaftesbury was one of these 8 people. And he basically was quite pro giving rights to the people who lived in this province. And so him and John Locke drew up the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which were adopted by the 8 proprietors, and really gave a lot of rights. It was an early form of a constitution. It was sort of earlier than the American Constitution, but it was kind of like a constitution for the province of Carolina. And it really sort of solidified Shaftesbury and Locke's reputations as being sort of pioneers of liberal constitutional monarchy sort of thinking. And so that's why I suppose he got his earldom, and he was elevated to the peerage as the Earl of Shaftesbury, and that's the earldom that's carried on through to the present day.
Okay, so he just to summarize that, so we're on the same page, met John Locke at university when he was being treated for some illness, and as a result of this, he kind of got very embroiled in the liberal sphere, and was a big player in that, which ultimately earned him his earldom. And that's how they became this kind of big, famously Whig political dynasty that were, as we'll see, have quite interesting impacts on architecture a bit later on. Is that a fair?
That is, yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. And it was really the Shaftesbury have a long relationship with philosophers and philosophy, and this is important because the second Earl was, an interesting and relatively influential man, but it was the third Earl who was the grandson of the first Earl. So I mentioned the third Earl made some changes to the house architecturally, but he was a key person he was a philosopher, he was a Whig politician, and he basically brought the Ashley Coopers back to England. So he as a child came back after the Glorious Revolution and ended up being very much part of the Whigs, which was sort of semi-founded by his grandfather, the first Earl.
Which is partly why his grandfather had also gone to Holland, right? Presumably.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And he wrote all sorts of volumes on philosophy. So he wrote a book called The Contents of Characteristics, which was about
thrilling.
Things like, it does, doesn't it? Things like the inquiry concerning virtue and merit.
Oh my God! I can see why you like him.
Rhapsody. Oh yeah, I love it. But he was opposed to Thomas Hobbes. So he was part of the sort of the Cambridge Platonists. He was very he was a fascinating man who was quite critical of Reformed theology and Protestantism, which is funny because then his descendant would become the opposite. And so I think what I find fascinating with the Ashley Coopers is they are such a mixed bunch. There are such extraordinary people there, and then there's some real sort of complete sort of anomalies in the family, and so I find it quite interesting. So that's sort of the descent to the third Earl, and that's sort of when the house began to take on a sort of new. It was sort of updated in line with the Georgian period.
So to interrupt, how was the liberal philosophy, shall we say, of the third Earl of Shaftesbury reflected in the architecture of the house? Because I think to most of us today, we don't tend to associate architecture and philosophy. They seem like two very separate disciplines. One's very tangible, one is somewhat intangible. But as we shall discuss, that's not how they thought back in the day. So what did he do?
Yeah. So, well, actually, interestingly, his biggest addition I suppose he updated the house. He wasn't the one who sort of added all the stucco ceilings. That was one of his. That came later. His big thing was he built a folly on the estate, which is called the Philosopher's Tower, which is quite a very. You love your follies, Rory, so you should look it up. It's actually quite an interesting folly because it's got this extraordinary sort of shingle dome, and then it's this this sort of block of brick with Georgian sashes and little eau de boeufs, so little round or oval shaped windows underneath all the way around. And I don't entirely know what it was used for or what it's used for now, but I assume it was where he would go and think and philosophize. I'd rather like a philosopher's tower.
God, you'd be insufferable if you had a philosopher's tower, honestly. I wouldn't bring you any tea at all. You'd be sitting there wittering away about something total nonsense. And I built a rival philosopher's tower.
Well, it'd be taller than mine.
I mean, bigger. Oh dear. We should. So, so he doesn't. Okay, forgive me. So he doesn't actually change the house. He just builds a folly called the Philosopher's Folly.
Yeah, but he also he starts to simplify the gardens, so wiping away some of the ornate Renaissance parterres and avenues, the symmetry he didn't like, and that continued. There's no evidence of who was the landscape designer, but essentially it was the landscape over the next sort of 100 years. So from the early the late 17th, early 18th century through to the late 18th, early 19th century, the grounds were gradually sort of turned into this naturalistic landscape park, which was sort of started by him, as I suppose that perhaps reflects his philosophy of sort of not wanting too much control. I suppose if you think about his opposition, like his ancestor, the first Earl's opposition to absolute monarchy, perhaps there was this line in the Shaftesburys where they didn't like too much control, and therefore perhaps they didn't like these formal avenues and parterres that, you know, where you've got to be clipping them all the time and controlling nature. And actually the romantic landscape that was pioneered by Capability Brown was much more sort of natural and less high maintenance, less controlled. That could be something in that, actually.
It's very interesting, Jeff. I mean, talking about these, you know, the loosening of the landscape that we've just been describing, which also related to this liberal philosophy, if you will, of the Shaftesburys and the kind of wider politics at the time. The Capability Brown Gardens, we'd now call it. I was having a dispute with someone about this recently, but one of the reasons it was created was that this looser landscape tradition that was arriving into England was considered to represent the loosening of the constitution. It was considered to be more natural, just as England was more natural compared to France, because we had this sort of better relationship between people and king. It's all kind of slightly strange, but that's how they thought about it at the time, and that's partly where that gardening tradition came from. Relates to John Locke, relates to the Whig Party, all this stuff we've been talking about. But something I'm curious about, Jeff, which I've discovered in my own studies, is that my great hero, John Vanbrugh, who I adore and love, and I think everyone should buy my book when it comes out, was shameless plug, was heavily attacked by, well, not heavily, but was certainly criticised by people, by the third Earl of Shaftesbury, for his architecture being too Baroque, and Shaftesbury was part of this clique which didn't like the Baroque particularly, and he supported the introduction of Palladianism to the UK, and Colleen Campbell, who was busy kind of trying to rewrite architectural rules, etc. But I mean,
it's funny, Roy, you mentioned that there is a little bit of hypocrisy, because you're absolutely right. The third Earl was a great champion of Palladianism, particularly because of his links with the Whig Party. So if our listeners cast their minds back to our episode on Wentworth Woodhouse, we talked about how they built the Earls of Fitzwilliam built this enormous red brick Baroque house, and then very soon after it was built, Baroque went out of fashion. It was seen as too European, too continental, too Catholic, too ornate, and Palladianism came in as the architecture of the Whigs. And so what the Earls of Fitzwilliam did was whack on a massive Palladian facade on the other side to disguise the Baroque. And it was very much the Whig Party was associated with Palladianism. It was sort of the simplicity. You know, the great powerhouses of the Whigs were houses like Holkham or Houghton, Wolterton, others. You know, so these big Palladian houses, plainer, well proportioned, but quite simple in their design. And that's and interestingly, Rory, we were talking about this earlier. Shaftesbury was a bit of a hypocrite because he championed this. He actually wrote a letter called "A Letter Concerning Design," which had a huge influence on Lord Burlington, who was famously a big champion of Palladianism. So, so Shaftesbury had a huge influence on Burlington. He had a huge influence on Palladianism, even though, ironically, and this is where the hypocrisy comes in, he didn't knock down St Giles and replace it with a Palladian house himself. He didn't Palladianify it at all, really. It stayed as this tower. Yes, apart from his philosopher's tower, exactly, which is quite simple in Palladian. But yeah, the house remained very similar to how it had been built by the first Earl: red brick, crenellations, mixture of Jacobean Renaissance and Palladian style. I mean, it's really interesting. So yeah, it is curious. But the Ashley Coopers remained very influential in the Whig Party for many more generations, and we can get onto that in a second.
Okay. So I think so. We've talked so far about where the family came from, the house, how it was developing, the complete hypocrisy of the Shaftesburys. I'm actually furious on behalf of poor old Vanbrugh and Red and Hawksmoor and all these poor guys. Oh, it just makes my blood boil. We talked about the gardens. A bit. Can we now talk a little bit about what was inside the house, the collection, the artwork, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So the collection, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot of it's actually an extraordinary collection even now. So the library was particularly impressive. A lot of rare theological texts, ancient books from 12th and 13th centuries, philosophy books, political texts, a lot of first edition works and manuscripts by John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire and Rousseau, old master paintings and portraits, fantastic furniture. The third Earl, who was this philosopher, but also had these he was a patron of the arts and collected all sorts of other interesting sort of not just artifacts, but sort of scientific instruments and stuff like that. And then we have the political documentation, the correspondence between prime ministers and their ministers from basically the first Earl onwards, because of their deep involvement in politics. They're one of the most political of the great aristocratic families in England, the Ashley Coopers. So quite a mixed but impressive collection, and we'll get on to sort of what happened to it and where it is today. A lot of it's still in the house, but that's kind of in a nutshell. But what's interesting is, so the Christopher Hussey, who was a architectural historian who wrote a lot for Country Life magazine, he wrote about St Giles, and this links quite nicely with what we're talking about, in that it didn't really change for many generations. Alterations inside in terms of stucco work and plaster work, but in essence, for about 200 years, it, as Christopher Hussey said, for the whole, so little changed in 2 centuries is a splendid example of the Kent manner changing into the Rococo of the mid-century. So what you get is you have this very sort of Kentian, and actually Inigo Jones sort of vibes, red brick house that changes very little, and then suddenly in the 19th century it's added to, they add these Rococo ceilings and all the rest of it. So it's quite an interesting mix of architectural styles.
So we were talking before the episode about how he was a kind of champion of social reform, and it sounded totally fascinating. I mean, what was his sort of? I'm spotting a theme here. I mean, there was that earlier Earl you mentioned, who maybe it was a member of the family, not the Earl, who was trying to introduce greater rights amongst his estates in America, which sounded sort of slightly kind of
the first Earl, that's right. Well, it's interesting that actually for our listeners, exactly, if you live in South Carolina, you will be aware of the Ashley and the Cooper rivers, which are named after the 2 parts of the Ashley Cooper surname, because that links with America. But yeah, you're right. I suppose really they are the great progressive families, quite pioneering thinkers in many ways, that the Ashley Coopers. They were ahead of their time in lots of ways. Firstly, I suppose in their politics and, campaigning for constitutional monarchies before even before the Restoration, let alone the Glorious Revolution, and then carrying on through to the seventh Earl, who is my great hero. So he,
why is he your great hero, Jeff?
because I suppose he had this extraordinary sense of duty and an awareness of, I mean, he had a very strong Christian faith, but he had a very keen awareness of the fact that he had been put in a position of influence and power. And because he felt it was God-given, that he had a duty to exercise that well. And so it was Lord Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury Avenue in London, one of the most famous streets in London, is named after the Earl of Shaftesbury, the seventh Earl, who was the great Victorian reformer. He's up there with the likes of Wilberforce. I often think he's overlooked because Wilberforce famously campaigned for the end of the abolition of the slave trade. But Lord Shaftesbury almost single-handedly passed laws that stopped children going up chimneys and down mines. He passed several poor laws. He started the first version of state education for all when he founded the Ragged Schools. He had a soup kitchen in his townhouse on Belgrave Square. He gave, not just did he exercises influence in the Commons to make great changes to better society, but he also personally gave much of his wealth and used his house away and used his houses for charitable purposes. So I think what I admire with him is that he recognized that he was a steward of what he owned, not an owner, and that he was given a responsibility to steward what he had well for the good of all. And that's why I think I admire him so much.
God, you've been saying this, Joe.
Despite being terribly right-wing, Rory, I actually am quite socially progressive.
Christian. As you've been saying this, you've been growing sideburns and a top hat. I've seen you sort of rising to the box in the House of Commons. Or it wouldn't be the House of Commons; it would be the House of Lords. Funny, yeah. I mean, it's the great sort of it's the great paradox in the kind of at the centre of the UK aristocracy, really, isn't it? It's this nature of this weird thing of immense privilege, which many would argue is unjustifiable, but privilege that they then use to help people when they don't have to. And you know that's been one funny thing about the UK aristocracy, which I think differentiates it from a lot of other aristocracies, and arguably one of the reasons it's still around, as well as, of course, its permeability and the fact that the UK class system is not closed, and it's always been quite sort of fluid, and who can get into it and who indeed falls out of it. But that's obviously not really a kind of conversation point for today. But the yes, this thing about the being the great patron, the patriarch even, is an interesting one. But I suppose, I mean, to be cynical, to play devil's advocate, you know, if you're someone with that much money and wealth, you know, you kind of need to do that, right? I mean, you can't possibly justify having that kind of influence and wealth without using it try to use it for the good of others.
Well, this goes back, Rory, I suppose, to what we've always talked about over the years, over the last year, in terms of, you know, I suppose, actually, I was talking to a friend about this yesterday. We talk often on this podcast about how, you know, country house owners, the landed estates, you know, aristocrats and so forth, are sort of like kings over their own miniature kingdoms. So an estate is like a miniature kingdom. You have villages on it, you have schools or cottage hospitals or whatever. And it's a bit like a king is a monarch over a country. So a landowner is sort of a monarch over their little piece of land. And in the same way, sometimes we get benevolent kings or monarchs like the late Queen Elizabeth II, who we know was a great servant of the people, who had a very strong sense of duty and whatever. But then other times we get kings who squander their wealth and live the high life and don't care about their people. And I think it's the same with landowners. Sometimes we get good ones who are benevolent and put others before themselves. And sometimes we get ones who just splash the cash and care about themselves only and live a hedonistic lifestyle, and sometimes lose everything and sometimes don't. And it's interesting, you know, I suppose it's like all people, you know, there are good ones, there are good eggs and bad eggs, and we need to hope and pray that there are more good eggs out there, like Lord Shaftesbury. I'll tell you what's interesting though, Rory, and you meant is when in one of his biographies, someone said that it was the likes of Shaftesbury, amongst others, who we need to thank for why we still have a monarch today. And the reason is, follow me, but bear with this, I think it's fascinating. The reason is that by campaigning for more rights for the working man, and securing those rights, there was less of an appetite amongst the working man for revolution when revolution was sweeping across Europe. So by passing these laws to stop children going up chimneys and down mines, by creating schools and hospitals and mental asylums and everything else for the working man, what we saw, I suppose, the appeasement of the people. And this wasn't the reason Shaftesbury did it, but we did see the appeasement of the people. So it then meant that when we had, French Revolution, and later the Russian Revolution, all these other revolutions sweeping through Europe, because of the great gap between the rich and the poor, the gap was less big in Britain, and therefore there was less of an appetite. And it's why, while some revolutionary ideas came across the Channel, our monarchs never saw Monsieur Guillotine or something like that, because the people have been generally appeased by the likes of Shaftesbury. So it's fascinating when you think about it like that actually these men who were seen as liberals and radicals in their time potentially saved the monarchy.
I think that's quite a bold claim, but I will reflect. I will reflect. I think there's a kernel of truth somewhere in that wonderful sort of what's the word I'm looking for? That you're standing the Shaftesbury's.
Possibly I'm putting them on too high a pedestal. I'll tell you a little side fact before we move on to the decline of the house. Is the 7th Earl famously, one of the most famous places in London is the Shaftesbury Memorial Fountain in Piccadilly Circus, where famously lots of people get engaged because they think it's a statue of Eros, the god of romantic love. But in fact, it's not the statue of Eros. It's the statue of Anteros, who is the god of requited love. And so this sculpture was created, Anteros, as the god of requited love, because it was sort of unconditional. The idea is that not only was Shaftesbury's love for the people unconditional, but so Shaftesbury's God loved his people unconditionally. So this is what was quite interesting. But what is quite fun, as a little side note, is there are two puns or two hidden messages in the Shaftesbury Memorial Fountain. So the first is that the Memorial Fountain points in the direction, or the Memorial Fountain faces in the direction of St Giles House in Dorset. And there is a second sculpture in the grounds of St Giles that faces back towards Piccadilly Circus. So these two sculptures of Anteros, the gods of requited love, facing each other across hundreds of miles. And then the pun is that the sculpture is pointing his or her bow and arrow at the ground, and the idea is that they're burying their shaft of their arrow, Shaftesbury. So there are two little puns there, which are quite clever. Just for those of you who are walking through Piccadilly Circus and see what they think is the sculpture of Eros, it's Anteros, and there's all that hidden messages. So it's quite fun.
That's really interesting. Wow, I didn't know any of that. That's fascinating. Thank you. Okay, so let's move to the decline. So we've got this, great family, very powerful political dynasty, blah 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 blah. Champions of social reform, but I mean, could you argue that they were turkeys voting for Christmas? That the reform turned around and bitten, and something went wrong. What happened?
What happened really was, I suppose, a series of unfortunate events. So what you had obviously, we know that a lot of houses were hit badly by taxation, by being requisitioned during the war, the First World War, and then later the Second World War. We know that, huge inheritance tax whacked on country house owners had a huge impact on their ability to survive. So they had to sell off acres and acres, and it's the same with the Ashley Coopers. So essentially, it was during the 20th century. So this peak in the late 19th century, the 7th Earl, and then the 8th Earl, and then the 9th Earl. We had his son, I believe, was killed in the Second World War. So Lord Ashley, so the title would then jump to his grandson, the 10th Earl, who we'll talk about in a minute. But it was during that tenure of the 9th Earl and his son, when he was running the estate before he was killed, where the estate really declined. So the taxation and the economic conditions seriously bad, but also the family made the decision to move out of the house in the 1950s and abandoned it. So They put a lot of paintings and furniture into storage, and they flogged a lot as well. And really, the house then sat rotting for the next 50 years. So, it's quite unusual, actually, Rory, that the house wasn't demolished, because so many houses, when the families couldn't afford to, or didn't, I get the impression with the Shaftesburys, there was an issue where it wasn't that they couldn't afford to renovate it. It's just they almost couldn't be bothered, which is why they didn't knock it down either. Many families, when their houses were deteriorating after the Second World War, demolished the houses rather than, pay to keep them up or let them rot. But what's interesting with the Shaftesburys is they just abandoned it. They moved to maybe a dower, I think it was a dower house in the estate, and this house just gradually declined over the years. And the family also faced a lot of tragedy. So the ninth Earl's son was killed, and so it went to his grandson, the 10th Earl. And there's, it's a really tragic story, and it's extraordinary when you think that the 10th Earl comes from the same family as those great diplomats and politicians that we talked about already. Because the 10th Earl had a really tragic life. In long story short, he was murdered. Rory, the 10th Earl was murdered in 2004 by his then wife and his third wife, who was a French-born Tunisian, a lady of the night, who he had met, and he moved to the south of France with her, ditched his family, and moved to the south of France and lived the high life on the south coast in France. And drove fast cars and all the rest of it. And then he was very tragically murdered by his wife Jamila and her brother, a Tunisian man, and they did it for financial motives. It's very Agatha Christie, very Poirot, and his body was found some months later in a ravine in the south of France, and she was locked up, as was her brother, and rightly so. But he squandered a lot. So when his grandfather died, he inherited a huge fortune. So the Shaftesbury estates included significant landholdings in central London.
But hang on, I'm a bit confused. Why did if he inherited lots and lots of money, why did they move to the dower?
Because they were so wealthy. They were so wealthy that despite all the death duties and everything, this is what I'm saying. This is why the house was never demolished. They were so wealthy that despite the fact that they had death duties and everything like that in the 40s and 50s, he still inherited. I suppose they were almost at one point sort of Grosvenor level, landowners. So they owned the Shaftesbury estate in London, all the land around Piccadilly, and they owned much of Brighton and Hove. They owned land in Versailles. They owned houses on the French Riviera. They had extraordinary paintings and collections. So essentially, this is why when he took over, he had these. He married 3 times. He ended up, as I said, being murdered on the south coast of France. But he, wonderfully, the house was never demolished. And I first came across the house, Rory. It must have been when I was a teenager, sort of 17, 18, and I had a very niche hobby, which was browsing the English Heritage at Risk Register to look up the prettiest and most derelict houses that could one day be restored. And top of the list was St Giles House, which was so damaged and rotting and decaying that it was on the English Heritage at Risk Register, at risk of collapsing, basically. And then the family was hit with a second tragedy, which in many ways proved to see its fortune change, because when the 10th Earl was murdered, his eldest son inherited, and his son was also called Anthony, and was a lovely man, also I've heard, and was hardworking. I think he trained to be an accountant or something, like very different, steady Eddie compared to his dad, who was living the high life in the south of France. And then out of the blue, soon after he inherited the title in 2004. When his father died, and in 2005 he died of a heart attack, age 27.
Oh no!
So a second tragedy hit the family, and this was only 20 years ago, and it's devastating. But then what's interesting is the title was inherited by his younger brother, the current Earl of Shaftesbury, Nick Ashley Cooper, who was at the time a DJ in New York, having fun in a nightclub, and really took up the role in a way that no one really could have imagined. He moved back to England, and we'll talk about this next week. But he basically has restored the house extraordinarily well, and married a lovely German vet who is very good at helping him manage everything and run everything. And really, it's turned out all these tragedies led to sort of the salvation of the house, really, and the estate. So it's a fascinating story, really, of decline and fall, and then sort of rebirth, which is why we've called these episodes exactly that.
Gosh, what interesting, tragic, but interesting and ultimately happy trajectory.
I think there's I think it looks pretty bright, the future of St Giles, from what I can see. They've got lovely children, and there are fantastic books and articles that have been written about the house. I mean, it has been restored unbelievably well, and we'll talk about that next week, because it's a whole story in itself, really.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Well, thank you for this trot through the Shaftesbury dynasty, Jeff. I've known the name for a while, but not that much more, other than the third Earl's relationship with utterly hypocritical relationship with Pelagianism, which still makes me angry. But it's been very interesting to learn about them in more detail. And I look forward next week to finding out about the modern day situation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rory, for joining me today, and thank you to our lovely listeners for joining us too. And please do email in any questions, especially if you have more questions about the Mitford sisters, our episode last week. We've had great feedback from lots of people who have lots of interesting thoughts. And do join us again next time for part 2 of St Giles, and we will talk about the rebirth and rejuvenation of this extraordinary estate. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.